This
Margaret
operation is
Hayes stood in
critical.
front of her bedroom mirror,
Failure is not an
smoothing
option.
down the collar of her navy
You
blue
understand the
dress.
stakes involved
At
here.
72 years old, she still carried herself with the kind of posture that spoke of decades of discipline. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though time had carved lines into her face, her eyes remained sharp and clear. Today was special. Today, her grandson Tommy was graduating from Marine Corps boot camp at Paris Island, South Carolina. She picked up the photograph from her dresser. Tommy in his dress blues, standing tall and proud during his initial training. He looked so much like his father had at that age. Her throat tightened. Tommy's father, her son David, had died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. David had been a Marine too, just like his mother before him. Margaret slipped on her lightweight cardigan to ward off the spring chill. The sleeves came down past her wrists, covering most of her forearms. She preferred it that way, had for a long time now. The drive from her small house in Beaufort to Paris Island took about 30 minutes. Margaret had made the trip many times over the years, though usually just to the main gate to pick up young Marines who needed a home-cooked meal and a kind word. She'd become something of a local legend among the younger troops, the sweet grandmother who baked cookies and listened to their homesick stories. But those young men and women never knew her real story. Nobody did anymore. As she pulled into the visitor parking area, Margaret could see families gathering everywhere. Mothers clutching tissues, fathers standing proud with cameras, siblings bouncing with excitement. The energy was electric with anticipation. She found a spot and turned off the engine, taking a moment to collect herself. Through the windshield, she could see the parade ground in the distance where the graduation ceremony would take place. Rows of young Marines would soon stand in perfect formation, transformed from uncertain civilians into disciplined warriors in just 13 weeks. Margaret knew that transformation well. She'd lived it herself 52 years ago, back when women in the military were still a rare sight and female Marines were viewed with suspicion and doubt. She gathered her purse and stepped out into the bright Carolina morning. The air smelled of salt marsh and fresh-cut grass. Families streamed past her toward the parade ground, their excited chatter filling the air. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young Marine in dress blues approached her with a polite smile. He couldn't have been more than 19. "Can I help you find your way?" "I'm fine, dear," Margaret said warmly. "I'm here for my grandson, Thomas Hayes. I know where I'm going." "Yes, ma'am. Congratulations to your family." He gave her a crisp nod and moved on to help an elderly couple struggling with folding chairs. Margaret made her way to the seating area, finding a spot in the middle section with a clear view. She settled onto the metal folding chair and placed her purse in her lap, watching as the stands filled up around her. To her left, a young woman with two small children was trying to keep them entertained. To her right, a man who appeared to be a retired Marine himself sat with ramrod-straight posture, his weathered face set in an expression of fierce pride. "Your first time here?" the man asked, glancing at Margaret. "First time for a graduation," she replied. "My grandson is graduating today." "Good for him, good for your family." The man extended his hand. Gunnery Sergeant Randall Price, retired. Margaret shook his hand firmly. "Margaret Hayes, pleased to meet you." "Your grandson will remember this day for the rest of his life," Price said. "I graduated from this same parade ground in 1972, changed everything for me." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, but she didn't share her own story. She never did. The morning grew warmer, and Margaret felt perspiration beginning to form on her neck. She shifted in her seat and her cardigan slipped slightly, riding up her forearm. She quickly tugged it back down, but not before catching the eye of a woman sitting in the row ahead. The woman had turned around and was staring at Margaret's wrist with an odd expression. Margaret met her gaze calmly until the woman looked away. At exactly 9 o'clock, a voice boomed over the loudspeaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of the colors. Everyone stood as one. The crowd fell silent as the color guard marched onto the parade ground with crisp, synchronized steps. The American flag led the way, followed by the Marine Corps flag, moving with ceremonial precision. Margaret's hand went to her heart automatically, her eyes fixed on the red, white, and blue. Even after all these years, the sight of that flag being carried with such honor and reverence made her chest tighten with emotion. Then came the graduates. Row after row of young Marines in their dress blues marched onto the field in perfect formation. Their faces were serious, focused, transformed from the uncertain young people who had arrived 13 weeks ago. Now they moved as one unit, their steps synchronized, their bearing proud. Margaret scanned the faces, looking for Tommy. There in the 3rd platoon she spotted him. His jaw was set, his eyes forward, his cover perfectly positioned. He looked strong, capable, grown. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away. David would have been so proud. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. Speeches were given by the commanding officers, awards were presented to distinguished graduates, and the national anthem was sung by a young corporal with a beautiful voice. When the final oath was administered, and the new Marines responded with a thunderous "Oorah!" the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. "That's my boy," someone shouted nearby. "We love you, Sarah," another voice called out. Margaret clapped along with everyone else, her face glowing with pride and joy. As the ceremony concluded and the formations began to break up, families surged forward to find their graduates. Margaret moved more slowly, letting the younger, more energetic relatives rush ahead. She knew Tommy would find her. And he did. "Grandma," his voice carried over the crowd, and then he was there, sweeping her up in a careful hug, mindful not to crush her. He towered over her now, this boy who used to climb into her lap for bedtime stories. "Oh, Tommy," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "Look at you, just look at you." "I did it, Grandma, I'm a Marine." His eyes were bright, almost disbelieving. "Yes, you are. Your father would be so proud, I'm so proud." They stood there for a moment, grandmother and grandson, connected by bonds of blood and service and loss. "Come on," Tommy said, keeping his arm around her shoulders. "I want you to meet my drill instructors and some of my buddies." He guided her through the crowd toward a group of young Marines standing near the edge of the parade ground. They were laughing and talking, still in their dress blues, their families clustered around them. "This is my grandmother," Tommy announced proudly to his friends. "Grandma, these are the guys from my squad." The young Marines greeted her politely, their manners impeccable. She could see the discipline and respect that had been drilled into them over the past 13 weeks. "Your grandson is a good Marine, ma'am," one of them said seriously. "He never quit even when things got tough." "That's because he comes from good stock," Margaret said with a smile. The April sun grew warmer, and the crowd began to thin as families started leaving to take their graduates out for celebratory meals. Margaret felt the heat building beneath her cardigan, but she kept it on. "Grandma, aren't you hot?" Tommy asked, noticing her discomfort. "I'm fine, dear." "You should take that sweater off. It's got to be 75 degrees out here." "Really, Tommy, I'm comfortable." He gave her a puzzled look but didn't push it. "Okay, well, I want you to meet my senior drill instructor before we go. He's right over there." Tommy pointed toward a group of drill instructors standing together in their distinctive Smokey Bear hats. Even from a distance, they commanded respect and authority. As they approached, Margaret could see the senior DI more clearly. He was a tall, powerfully built man in his early 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years of service in harsh conditions. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and badge perfectly positioned. His nameplate read, "Gunnery Sergeant Morrison." "Sir, this is my grandmother, Margaret Hayes," Tommy said, his voice filled with respect. Morrison turned to face them and his expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your grandson did exceptionally well during training. You should be very proud." "I am," Margaret said, extending her hand. Morrison shook it, and as he did, Margaret's cardigan sleeve rode up slightly, exposing the lower part of her forearm. Something changed in Morrison's expression. His eyes focused on her wrist, and his handshake froze mid-motion. The color seemed to drain from his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly rough, "that tattoo on your arm." Margaret's heart began to pound. She tried to pull her hand back and adjust her sleeve, but Morrison held on gently, his eyes never leaving her wrist. Other people began to notice the exchange. Conversation around them quieted. "May I?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. With careful, almost reverent movements, Morrison pushed back her sleeve, revealing the full tattoo on her forearm. It was faded with age, the ink blurred by decades and sun exposure, but still clearly visible. The Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor, and beneath it numbers. A service number from an era before Social Security numbers were used. But it was the words above the emblem that made Morrison's breath catch. Vietnam, 1972-1973, USMC Medical Corps. The silence spread outward like ripples in a pond. Marines and families alike stopped talking, stopped moving, all eyes turning toward the elderly woman in the navy blue dress and the senior drill instructor who stood before her with tears suddenly streaming down his weathered face. Margaret stood perfectly still as more people gathered around them, drawn by the unusual sight of a hardened drill instructor openly weeping. She could feel Tommy's confusion beside her, could sense the questions building in everyone around them, but her eyes remained locked on Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's face. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice shaking, "I need to ask you something. Were you at Da Nang, the field hospital near the airbase?" Margaret's throat went dry. She hadn't spoken about those days in decades, hadn't let herself remember the heat, the blood, the endless stream of broken bodies, the sounds that still visited her in nightmares. "Yes," she whispered. Morrison's hands were trembling now. He seemed to be struggling with something, fighting some internal battle. Finally, he spoke again. "March 1973. I was 19 years old. Lance Corporal James Morrison, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. We got hit during a patrol 2 days before the ceasefire went into effect." His voice cracked. "I took shrapnel to my chest and leg, lost a lot of blood. They said I wouldn't make it to the hospital." Margaret felt the years falling away, felt herself pulled back to that suffocating heat, that endless war. "But someone kept me alive during the medevac flight," Morrison continued. "A Navy corpsman, they told me later, except it wasn't a corpsman, it was a Marine Corps nurse. A woman who refused to let me die, who kept pressure on my wounds for the entire helicopter ride, who talked to me, kept me conscious, kept me fighting." The memories were flooding back now. Margaret could see them, those final desperate days before the American withdrawal. The wounded kept coming even as the war was supposed to be ending. She remembered the helicopters, remembered so many young faces. "I never got her name," Morrison said. "I was in and out of consciousness, and by the time I was stable enough to ask, she was gone, shipped out. I asked everyone, tried to find her, but back then there weren't many women serving and the records were." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I've wondered my whole life who she was, the woman who saved my life." He looked down at her tattoo again, at the dates inscribed there. "How many female Marines served in the Medical Corps in Vietnam?" he asked softly. "Not many," Margaret admitted. "We weren't officially allowed in combat zones, but field hospitals didn't count as combat zones according to the rules. There were maybe a dozen of us at Da Nang during those last few months." "Do you remember me?" Morrison asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Do you remember that day? Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself go back. March 1973. The chaos as everyone prepared for withdrawal. The endless casualties from operations that seemed pointless when the war was already lost. And then, like a photograph developing, a memory surfaced. A helicopter landing in a storm of dust and noise, her running to meet it with her medical bag. A young Marine, so young, barely more than a boy, with blood soaking through his uniform, his eyes rolling back in his head as life leaked out of him. She remembered grabbing him, remembered the way his blood felt hot and sticky on her hands, remembered screaming at the pilot to take off, to go, to move faster. She remembered talking to that boy, telling him about her own son who was 3 years old back home, telling him he had to stay awake, had to keep breathing, had to live. You kept asking about your mother, Margaret said quietly, opening her eyes. You wanted me to tell her you were sorry, sorry for enlisting, sorry for worrying her. I told you that you could tell her yourself, that you were going to make it. Morrison made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She died 10 years ago, but I got to tell her. I got to tell her in person, because of you. The crowd around them had grown larger now. Marines and civilians alike stood in complete silence, witnesses to a moment that transcended the normal boundaries of military ceremony. Tommy's face was pale with shock. "Grandma, you never told me. You never said you served in Vietnam." "You never asked, dear," Margaret said simply. "And I didn't like to talk about it, still don't really. It was a long time ago." "A long time ago." Morrison's voice rose slightly, though it remained respectful. "Ma'am, do you understand what you did? Do you understand how many lives you saved?" Margaret felt uncomfortable with the attention. This was exactly why she never spoke about her service. She'd done her job, nothing more. Thousands of others had done the same. "I was a nurse," she said firmly. "I did what nurses do, what they're trained to do." "In a war zone," Morrison pressed. "Under fire, under conditions that would break most people. And you didn't just do it once. You did it day after day for months." Another voice spoke up from the crowd. "I heard about the women who served in Vietnam." It was the retired gunnery sergeant who'd sat next to Margaret during the ceremony. "They didn't get parades when they came home, didn't get recognition. Most people didn't even know they were there." "We weren't looking for recognition," Margaret said. "We were looking to help people, to save lives." "But you should have gotten it anyway," Morrison said. "You should have been honored, thanked, celebrated. Instead." He gestured at her cardigan, at the way she'd kept her tattoo hidden. "Instead, you've been hiding who you are, what you did." Margaret's face flushed. "It wasn't like that. After I came home, people didn't want to hear about the war. They were angry about it, tired of it. And when they found out I was there, they had questions I couldn't answer, assumptions I couldn't correct. It was easier to just move on, to be a wife, a mother, a grandmother, to let that part of my life stay in the past." "That's not right," Tommy said, his voice tight with emotion. "Grandma, that's not right at all. You're a hero." "I'm not a hero, Tommy. I'm just—" "Ma'am," Morrison cut her off gently but firmly. "With all due respect, you don't get to decide that. I get to decide that. And every other Marine whose life you saved gets to decide that." He straightened to attention and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Margaret stood frozen, unsure how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had saluted her, so long since she'd been acknowledged as a veteran, as a Marine. Slowly, instinctively, her own hand came up to return the salute. And then something remarkable happened. Every Marine on that parade ground, young and old, active duty and retired, came to attention and saluted. Tommy saluted. The other drill instructors saluted. The new graduates in their dress blues, some of them with tears streaming down their faces, all stood and saluted this elderly woman they'd never met, this grandmother who'd hidden her service for half a century. The moment stretched out, suspended in time. Margaret felt something breaking open inside her chest, Some wall she'd built decades ago finally crumbling. Tears she'd held back for 50 years began to flow freely down her face. Morrison lowered his salute and stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something else. I became a drill instructor because of you, because of what you taught me that day in the helicopter." "I didn't teach you anything," Margaret said through her tears. "You were unconscious." "No," Morrison shook his head. "You taught me what it means to refuse to give up on someone. You taught me that every life matters, that every Marine matters. When you talked to me, when you kept me conscious, you didn't know anything about me. You didn't know if I was a good person or a bad person, if I was brave or cowardly, if I deserved to live or die. You just knew I was a Marine, and that was enough. You fought for me." He paused, collecting himself. "I've trained thousands of Marines over my career, and with every single one of them I've remembered that lesson. Every recruit matters. Every life is worth fighting for. You taught me that. And through me, you've touched thousands of lives. You've saved thousands of lives in ways you'll never know." Margaret couldn't speak. The weight of his words, the enormity of what he was saying, was too much. A new voice spoke up from the crowd. It was the base commander, Colonel Sarah Bennett, who had been observing the graduation ceremony from a distance. She approached now, her expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Hayes, I couldn't help but overhear. I wonder if you might join me for a moment." Margaret nodded, still too overwhelmed to trust her voice. Colonel Bennett led her a short distance away from the crowd, far enough for privacy, but close enough that people could still see them. Morrison and Tommy followed at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Hayes," Bennett began, "how long did you serve?" 6 years total," Margaret said. 1970 to 1976. I was in Vietnam from 72 to 73, then stateside after that until my service commitment was up." "And your rank when you left?" "First lieutenant." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "And after you left the service, did you ever pursue any recognition for your service in Vietnam? Any medals, commendations?" Margaret shook her head. "I just wanted to come home and be normal. My husband was supportive, but he didn't really understand what I'd been through. Nobody did. It was easier to just put it behind me." "I understand," Bennett said gently. "Many Vietnam veterans felt that way. But times have changed, Mrs. Hayes. The nation understands now, or at least understands better, what that war cost, what it cost the people who served." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "What you did in Vietnam, the lives you saved, the service you gave, that deserves to be recognized, not hidden away, not forgotten." "I don't need recognition," Margaret protested. "I really don't. I just came here today to watch my grandson graduate, to be proud of him, that's all." "I know," Bennett said, "but sometimes it's not about what we need, it's about what's right." The next week passed in a blur for Margaret. What should have been a quiet celebration of Tommy's graduation turned into something she never could have anticipated. The story of her encounter with Gunnery Sergeant Morrison spread through the Marine Corps community like wildfire. Someone had recorded the moment on their phone, and the video went viral on social media. "Vietnam nurse reunites with Marine she saved" became a national news story. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Veterans organizations reached out. Other Marines who had been treated at Da Nang in those final months began tracking her down, wanting to know if she remembered them, wanting to thank her. It was overwhelming and exhausting and terrifying. "Grandma, you need to tell your story," Tommy insisted, sitting in her living room on a Saturday afternoon. He was on leave for 2 weeks before reporting to his first duty station. "People need to hear this." "I don't want attention," Margaret said for what felt like the 100th time. "I never wanted attention. I just wanted to live my life." "But why?" Tommy asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why hide something so important?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph on her mantel. Her son David in his Marine dress blues, smiling, alive, years before Afghanistan took him from her. When I came home from Vietnam, she said slowly, people weren't kind to veterans. They protested the war and they took it out on the people who fought in it. And when they found out I was a woman who'd served, it was even worse. They asked me horrible questions. They made assumptions about what I'd done over there, about my morals, my character. She swallowed hard. One time I was at the grocery store and I ran into a woman from my church. Somehow she'd found out about my service. She asked me, right there in the produce aisle, if I'd slept with soldiers to make them feel better before they died. Can you imagine? Can you imagine someone asking you that? Tommy's face went red with anger. That's disgusting. It was, Margaret agreed. And it wasn't an isolated incident, so I learned to keep quiet. I put my uniform in a box in the attic. I covered my tattoo. I became just another housewife, just another mom, just another grandmother. It was safer that way, simpler. But Grandma, that was wrong. Those people were wrong. I know that now, Margaret said. But at the time, I just wanted peace. I wanted to raise my son, love my husband, have a normal life. And I got that. I got 50 years of normal, 50 years of peace. Except you weren't at peace, Tommy said quietly. Were you? You were hiding. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. He was right. All these years she'd told herself she'd moved on, that she'd let the past go. But she hadn't. She just buried it, pushed it down, pretended it didn't exist. The nightmares that still came sometimes. The way her heart raced when she heard helicopters overhead. The tears that came unbidden when she saw young Marines, so like the boys she'd treated, the ones she'd saved and the ones she'd lost. Maybe you're right, she admitted. Her doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone, and she'd stopped answering the door for reporters days ago. Tommy went to check, and a moment later he returned with Gunnery Sergeant Morrison. Sir, Tommy came to attention. Relax, Hayes, Morrison said with a slight smile. I'm off duty. He turned to Margaret. Ma'am, I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I have something I need to discuss with you, and I thought it was better to do it in person. Please sit down, Margaret said, gesturing to the sofa. Would you like some coffee? That would be kind, thank you. A few minutes later, they were all seated with coffee cups in hand. Morrison seemed nervous, which was odd for a man who commanded authority so naturally. Ma'am, he began, the reason I'm here is that Colonel Bennett has been doing some research into your service record. With your permission, of course. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. What kind of research? She's been going through the old records from Da Nang, the field hospital where you served. She's been talking to other veterans, compiling testimony, gathering documentation. Morrison paused. Ma'am, are you aware that you were recommended for a Bronze Star in 1973? Margaret's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. What? No, that's not possible. I never received any such recommendation. That's because the paperwork was lost in the chaos of the withdrawal, Morrison explained. Your commanding officer, a Captain Susan Reynolds, wrote up a recommendation for your actions during a rocket attack on the hospital compound. According to her report, you continued treating wounded Marines while the base was under direct fire, and you personally evacuated 3 critical patients to safety when the medical tent took a direct hit. The memory came back in fragments, the screaming of incoming rockets, the explosion that tore through the tent, the smoke, the fire, the patients who couldn't move on their own. I didn't do anything special, Margaret said automatically. Anyone would have done the same. But not everyone did, Morrison countered gently. According to the records, several staff members evacuated to the bunkers. You stayed. You kept working. The patients couldn't evacuate themselves, Margaret said simply. Someone had to stay with them. Morrison exchanged a glance with Tommy. Ma'am, Colonel Bennett believes that the recommendation for your Bronze Star, along with several other commendations that were filed but never processed, can be reconsidered. The military has been working to correct oversights like this, especially for women and minorities whose service wasn't properly recognized at the time. I don't understand, Margaret said. What does that mean? It means that you might finally receive the recognition you deserved 50 years ago, Morrison said. The medals, the commendations, the formal acknowledgement of your service and sacrifice. Margaret set down her coffee cup, her hands shaking. I don't want medals. I told you I just want to be left alone. Grandma, Tommy started. No, Margaret said firmly. You don't understand, both of you. These medals, this recognition, it won't change anything. It won't bring back the boys who died. It won't erase the nightmares. It won't make the past 50 years of hiding somehow worthwhile. It'll just dredge up things that should stay buried. Morrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. Ma'am, with respect, I disagree. This isn't about changing the past. It's about changing the present. It's about showing other women who serve, other women who will serve in the future, that their contributions matter, that they won't be forgotten or erased from history. He's right, Grandma, Tommy added. Think about the young women graduating from boot camp right now. Don't you think they should know about you? Don't you think they deserve to have heroes who look like them? Margaret felt tears welling up again. She'd cried more in the past week than she had in the past 10 years. I'm not a hero, she whispered. You are to me, Morrison said simply. You are to every Marine you saved. You are to your grandson, to your country, to the core. The room fell silent. Outside, Margaret could hear children playing in the street, a car driving by, the normal sounds of normal life. The life she'd built for herself, brick by brick, year by year. But maybe Tommy and Morrison were right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let the truth out, not just for herself, but for all the other women who'd served in silence, who'd been forgotten or overlooked or dismissed. All right, she said finally. All right. Tell Colonel Bennett I'll cooperate with her research, but I'm not making any promises about ceremonies or publicity or anything like that. One step at a time. Morrison's face broke into a wide smile. That's all we're asking, ma'am. One step at a time. He stood to leave but paused at the door. Ma'am, there's one more thing. Tomorrow there's a gathering at the VFW Hall in Beaufort. It's a regular Sunday meeting, nothing formal, but word has gotten around about your story and some of the local veterans would like to meet you. No reporters, no cameras, just veterans. Would you consider coming? Margaret looked at Tommy, who nodded encouragingly. All right, she said, I'll come. The next day, Margaret dressed carefully in a simple skirt and blouse. At the last minute, she chose not to wear her cardigan. Instead, she left her arms bare, her faded tattoo visible to anyone who looked. Tommy drove her to the VFW Hall, a modest building on the outskirts of Beaufort. The parking lot was fuller than Margaret expected, and she felt a flutter of nervousness. It'll be fine, Grandma, Tommy assured her. These are your people. They walked inside together and conversation stopped. Margaret found herself facing a room full of veterans, men and women of all ages, from Vietnam era to recent conflicts. Some were in wheelchairs, some used canes, some bore visible scars, others carried invisible wounds. And then, as one, they stood. Not at attention, not in any formal military way. Just stood as a sign of respect, as an acknowledgement, as a welcome. An elderly man with a Vietnam veteran's cap approached her. Ma'am, I'm Frank Sullivan. I was Army, 173rd Airborne. I was wounded in '72 and treated at Da Nang before being medevaced to Japan. I don't know if you were the nurse who helped me, but on behalf of all of us who were there, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for not forgetting us. Others came forward then, one by one, to shake her hand, to introduce themselves, to share their own stories. Margaret listened to each one, and with each story she felt something shifting inside her. These people understood. They'd lived through the same hell, carried the same scars, struggled with the same silence when they came home. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. A woman about Margaret's age approached last. She was thin, with short gray hair and kind eyes. "Margaret," she said softly, "I don't know if you remember me. Susan Reynolds, I was your at Da Nang." Margaret stared at her former commanding officer, stunned. "Captain Reynolds, I thought. I tried to find you after the war, but I couldn't." "I got out as soon as my commitment was up," Reynolds said. "Like you, I wanted to put it all behind me. I became a teacher, raised a family, tried to forget." She smiled sadly. "But we can't really forget, can we?" "No," Margaret agreed. "We can't." Reynolds took her hand. "I meant every word of that Bronze Star recommendation. You were the bravest person I ever served with. What you did that day during the rocket attack, what you did every day, was extraordinary. I'm sorry the paperwork got lost. I'm sorry you never got the recognition you deserved." "It's all right," Margaret said. "I survived. I had a good life." "But you had to hide who you were to have it," Reynolds said. "That's not right. That's not how it should have been." 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of another mirror, but this time she wore a very different outfit. Her old Marine Corps dress blue uniform had been carefully altered to fit her 72-year-old frame. It had taken some doing to find it in the attic, moth-eaten and faded, but a skilled tailor had worked miracles. The uniform felt strange on her body after so many years. Strange, but also right. Like putting on a piece of herself she'd lost long ago. Tommy knocked on the bedroom door. "Grandma, they're ready for you." Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door. Tommy stood in his own dress blues, looking sharp and proud. "You look amazing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I look old," Margaret corrected with a slight smile. "You look like a Marine," he said firmly. They drove together to Paris Island, where a special ceremony had been arranged. Colonel Bennett had been true to her word, tracking down every piece of documentation about Margaret's service, every after-action report, every testimony from fellow Marines who'd served with her. The Bronze Star had been approved. So had a Navy Commendation Medal and a Combat Action Ribbon, both previously unrecorded. But more than that, the Marine Corps had agreed to hold a formal recognition ceremony, acknowledging not just Margaret's service, but the service of all the women who'd served in Vietnam. The ceremony was being held in the same location where Tommy had graduated, but the atmosphere was very different. Instead of proud families, the stands were filled with active-duty Marines, veterans, and military dignitaries. News cameras lined the back, though Margaret had insisted on strict limits on media access. As she walked onto the parade ground with Tommy at her side, Margaret saw faces she recognized. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison stood in formation with other drill instructors. Susan Reynolds sat in the front row. Frank Sullivan and other veterans from the VFW were there. But there were also faces she didn't recognize. Young female Marines, currently serving, who had asked to attend. Historians who'd been documenting the stories of women in Vietnam. Representatives from veterans organizations. Colonel Bennett met them at the center of the parade ground. "First Lieutenant Margaret Hayes," she said formally. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice." The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The citations were read aloud, detailing actions Margaret had almost forgotten, moments of courage she dismissed as simply doing her job. When Bennett pinned the Bronze Star on Margaret's uniform, the crowd erupted in applause. Marines and civilians alike stood and cheered for this woman who'd served in silence for so long. But the most powerful moment came when Bennett stepped aside and Morrison approached. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground through the microphone system. "52 years ago, you saved my life. You refused to let me die in that helicopter. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." He paused, emotion evident in his voice. I stand here today not just as a Marine, but as a husband, a father, a grandfather. I've had 52 years of life that I wouldn't have had without you. I've loved, laughed, cried, served, grown, all because you wouldn't give up on a scared 19-year-old kid you didn't even know. Morrison's voice broke slightly. I can never repay that debt. None of us can. But what we can do is make sure that your story and the stories of all the women who served with you are never forgotten, never dismissed, never erased from history. He came to attention and saluted. Thank you, Lieutenant Hayes. Thank you for my life. Margaret returned the salute, tears streaming down her face. After the ceremony, there was a reception in one of the base buildings. Margaret found herself surrounded by people wanting to meet her, to thank her, to hear her stories. A young female lance corporal approached hesitantly. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I'm going into the medical field. I want to be a Navy corpsman. And hearing your story, knowing what you did, it makes me proud. It makes me believe I can do it too." Margaret took the young woman's hand. "What's your name, dear?" "Lance Corporal Maria Santos, ma'am." "Maria, you're going to do wonderful things," Margaret said. "And when things get hard, when people doubt you or question whether you belong, you remember that you're standing on the shoulders of all the women who came before you. You're not alone." "Thank you, ma'am. That means everything." As the reception continued, Margaret found a quiet moment to step outside. The sun was setting over Paris Island, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Tommy. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm all right," Margaret said. "A little overwhelmed, but all right." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset. "Grandma," Tommy said eventually, "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "For not asking. For all those years I never asked about your service. I knew you'd been in the military because Dad told me once, but I never pushed for details. I should have. I should have wanted to know." Margaret put her hand on his arm. "You were a child, Tommy. You didn't know to ask, and I didn't make it easy. I hid that part of myself away." "But why? I still don't fully understand why you hid it for so long." Margaret considered the question carefully. When you go through something traumatic, something that changes you fundamentally, you have two choices. You can integrate it into who you are, let it shape you openly, or you can compartmentalize it, put it in a box, and only take it out when you're alone. I chose the second option because it felt safer. Because the world wasn't ready to accept women who'd served in combat, even if we weren't supposed to be in combat. Because I was tired of defending my choices, my service, my sacrifice. She paused, looking out at the parade ground where she'd been honored just hours before. But what I didn't realize was that by hiding my story, I was letting other people control the narrative. I was letting them decide that women's contributions didn't matter, that our service was less important, less valuable. I was helping to erase us from history. "And now," Tommy asked. "Now I'm taking back my story," Margaret said firmly. "Not because I want glory or recognition, but because it's the truth, because it matters, because the young women serving today deserve to know they're part of a long tradition of courage and service." Tommy hugged her, carefully so as not to wrinkle her uniform. "Dad would be so proud of you." "I hope so," Margaret whispered. "I really hope so." The next morning, Margaret woke to find her story on the front page of the local newspaper. "Vietnam nurse finally honored after 52 years," read the headline, with a photo of her receiving the Bronze Star. Her phone began ringing early. More interview requests, more veterans reaching out, more people wanting to share their own stories. But there was one call that stood out, a woman's voice, elderly and hesitant. "Is this Margaret Hayes, the Margaret Hayes who served in Vietnam?" "Yes, this is she." "My name is Patricia Morrison. I'm James Morrison's mother. The Marine you saved in 1973. Margaret sat down, her heart pounding. Mrs. Morrison, your son told me you'd passed away. What? No, dear, I'm very much alive. James must have been thinking of his mother-in-law. She passed a decade ago. Patricia laughed softly. I'm 89 years old, but I'm still here. I'm so glad, Margaret said sincerely. I had to call you, Patricia continued. I had to thank you personally for giving me back my son. James came home from Vietnam a different person than the boy who left. Quieter, more serious, carrying wounds I couldn't see. But he was alive. He came home, and that was because of you. Patricia's voice wavered with emotion. He's been a good man, my James. A good husband, a good father. He's helped so many young people through his work as a drill instructor. And none of that would have happened if you hadn't fought for him that day. So thank you. Thank you from a mother who got to watch her son grow old. Thank you for the grandchildren I've been blessed to know. Thank you for every moment I've had with him these past 52 years. Margaret was crying now, unable to speak. I know you probably think you were just doing your job, Patricia said gently. But to me, you're an angel. You're the reason my boy came home, and I'll thank God for you every day for the rest of my life. After they hung up, Margaret sat for a long time, holding the phone, letting the tears flow. This was why it mattered. Not the medals or the ceremonies or the recognition. This was why telling her story, acknowledging her service, stepping out of the shadows mattered. Because every life she'd saved had rippled outward, touching other lives, creating futures that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Mothers who got their sons back, children who grew up with fathers, grandchildren who learned from grandfathers. She'd spent 50 years thinking her service was in the past, something to be buried and forgotten. But it wasn't. It lived on in every person she'd saved, every life she'd touched, every moment of love and joy and connection that happened because someone lived instead of died. Over the following weeks, Margaret gave several carefully selected interviews. She spoke at local schools, talking to young people about service and sacrifice. She attended veterans' events, connecting with others who'd served in Vietnam. And she began writing. Not a book exactly, but a memoir of sorts. Stories from her time in Vietnam, memories she'd kept locked away for decades. She wrote about the patients she'd saved and the ones she'd lost. She wrote about the other nurses and corpsmen who'd served alongside her. She wrote about the fear and the courage, the heartbreak and the hope. Susan Reynolds helped her, filling in details from her own perspective, helping Margaret remember things she tried to forget. We're not writing this for ourselves, Reynolds said one afternoon as they worked together in Margaret's living room. We're writing it for the women who will come after us, so they'll know they're not the first, so they'll know they're not alone. One day, 6 months after the ceremony at Paris Island, Margaret received a package in the mail. It was from the Marine Corps Historical Division. Inside was a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed a field hospital in Vietnam, a large tent with the Red Cross symbol visible, and in front of the tent, a group of nurses in their fatigues, smiling despite everything, despite the war and the fear and the exhaustion. Margaret was there, young and vibrant, her arm around Susan Reynolds. Other faces she recognized, some she'd forgotten. But what struck her most was the handwritten note on the back of the photo. Da Nang Field Hospital, March 1973. The bravest women I ever knew. They saved lives, saved souls, saved hope in a hopeless place. They should never be forgotten. It was signed by a Marine chaplain who'd served at the hospital. He'd passed away years ago, but somehow his photograph had survived, had been preserved, had found its way to Margaret at exactly the moment she needed it. She placed the photo on her mantel, next to the picture of David. 2 generations of service, 2 generations of sacrifice, connected by love and courage and an unwavering commitment to something larger than themselves. That evening, Tommy came to visit, now settled into his first duty station at Camp Lejeune. "How are you doing, Grandma?" he asked, noticing the new photograph. I'm good, Margaret said, and she meant it. I'm really good. No regrets about going public with your story. Margaret thought about the question carefully. No regrets. It's been hard sometimes dredging up old memories, but it's also been healing, freeing. I spent so long hiding who I was, what I'd done. Now I can just be myself, all of myself, without shame or fear. She smiled at her grandson. You know what the best part has been? The letters. I've gotten hundreds of letters from young women in the military thanking me for sharing my story, telling me that knowing about me has helped them believe they belong, that they can do this too. That's worth more than any medal. Tommy hugged her. You've become a role model, Grandma, an inspiration. I'm just a woman who did her job and tried to help people, Margaret protested. No, Tommy said firmly. You're a Marine who served with honor and courage. You're a hero who saved lives. You're a grandmother who taught me that hiding your light doesn't serve anyone. You're all of those things, and you should be proud. Margaret looked at her reflection in the window, seeing herself clearly for the first time in years. Not just an elderly woman, not just a grandmother, but a veteran, a Marine, a survivor, a warrior. You're right, she said softly. I am proud. It took me 52 years to say it, but I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of who I was and who I am. Outside, the sun was setting again, painting the South Carolina sky in brilliant colors. Somewhere on a military base, young Marines were training, learning, preparing to serve. Some of them were women, following in the footsteps of pioneers they'd never heard of, standing on shoulders they didn't know existed. But now, because Margaret had finally told her story, those women would know. They would understand that they were part of a legacy, a tradition of service and sacrifice that stretched back decades. And somewhere in a quiet moment, one of those young women might see Margaret's story and think, if she could do it, so can I. That, Margaret realized, was the real reason to step out of the shadows, not for recognition or glory, but to light the way for others, to be the example she wished she'd had when she was young and uncertain and wondering if she truly belonged. The tattoo on her forearm caught the fading light, the faded ink still visible, still proud. The eagle, globe, and anchor, the dates of her service, the proof that she'd been there, that she'd served, that she'd mattered. She'd spent 50 years covering it up. She would never cover it up again. Margaret Hayes was a Marine. She'd always been a Marine. And finally, after all these years, she could say it with her whole heart.